It was a cold, dreary night in the heart of the city when Richard Langford, a successful billionaire businessman, found her on the street. She was young, no older than 19, with a swollen belly, the unmistakable sign of pregnancy. Her clothes were torn, dirty, and barely enough to protect her from the biting wind. She looked like someone who had been through the worst life could throw at her. And there she was, lying in the gutter, her face buried in her knees, trying to shield herself from the world. Richard, on his way to a meeting, had never expected to encounter something like this. He was a man, used to luxury, wealth, and everything money could buy. But as he passed by her, something tugged at his heart. Something inside him told him to stop, to help. He couldn't explain it. He barely noticed the way she looked, or how her frail frame seemed so out of place on the gritty street. What he did notice was the helplessness in her eyes, the look of someone who had lost everything. He approached her cautiously, unsure of what to say, but the moment she lifted her head, he saw the tears streaming down her face. She was crying, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Please, don't leave me here," she pleaded. "I'm all alone." Richard's heart sank as he stared at the young girl, and in that moment, he knew he had to help. Without thinking, he reached out his hand. "Come with me," he said. "You don't belong here." She hesitated at first, clearly unsure of what this stranger wanted. But then, with no other options, she slowly reached out and took his hand. The moment she did, something inside Richard shifted. He was no longer just a billionaire businessman. He was a man who couldn't leave a person in need. She was fragile, alone, and carrying the weight of a child in her womb. Yet, in a city full of people, no one had cared to help her, until now. As he helped her into his car and drove her to his mansion, Richard couldn't help but wonder about the story behind her. Why was she homeless? Who had left her in such a state? He felt an urge to protect her, to shield her from the harshness of the world. But as the car pulled into the driveway, a deeper question lingered in his mind. Could this act of kindness lead to something more than he ever expected? Could he possibly help this girl, who seemed so helpless, to rebuild her life? And what would happen next? As they entered the grand entrance of his mansion, Richard could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had just brought a pregnant, homeless girl into his home. She wasn't someone from his world. She wasn't someone he would ever have imagined being with. Yet, there was something undeniable about her, something that called to him, made him want to help, to offer her a chance at something better. He watched her sit quietly on the sofa, her eyes darting nervously around his home, unsure of where she was or what to say. "What's your name?" Richard asked, trying to break the silence. "Ava," she replied softly. "Ava Collins," Richard nodded, sensing her discomfort. "Ava," he repeated, allowing the name to settle in his mind. "What happened to you, Ava? How did you end up on the streets?" Ava looked away, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. I don't want to talk about it," she whispered, her voice trembling. Richard's heart went out to her. He could see the pain behind her eyes, the depth of her suffering, but he didn't push her. Instead, he offered her food and a comfortable place to sleep. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had done something meaningful, something that went beyond his wealth and success. As the night passed, Richard couldn't help but think about what had just transpired. The homeless girl he had found on the street, Ava, had completely turned his life upside down. He had offered her help, but now, as she slept in the guest room, Richard found himself wondering if there was more to this story than he could understand. Why had fate brought them together? Was this just an act of kindness? Or was there something deeper at play here? What would happen if he kept her in his home? What was going to happen next? Would he grow to care for her more than he ever anticipated? The suspense was thick in the air, and Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger journey. Where is Ava's story heading? Would she remain just a girl in need of a helping hand? Or could something unexpected unfold between them? The days that followed felt strange to Richard. Ava had settled into his home, and yet there was an undeniable tension between them, an unspoken bond that neither of them knew how to handle. Richard, used to running a multi-million-dollar business empire, found himself at a loss for words whenever he looked at her. She wasn't like the women he was used to being around. She wasn't polished or composed, but there was something real about her, a raw honesty, that both fascinated and unnerved him. Ava, on the other hand, was still getting used to the lavish surroundings of Richard's mansion. She couldn't fathom how she had ended up in this situation, sitting in a luxurious living room, with all the comfort she had ever dreamed of but never had. She couldn't understand why someone like Richard, who had everything, would take the time to help someone like her. It made no sense. Was it charity? Or was there something else? For the first time in weeks, Ava was allowed to rest. She slept without fear, ate without wondering where her next meal would come from, and had a roof over her head. But the emotional scars of her past still haunted her. She couldn't let go of the memories that clung to her like shadows. The street had been her home for so long that it was hard to imagine a different life. Even now, she struggled to believe that Richard's kindness wasn't just a fleeting moment of generosity. Richard, meanwhile, couldn't stop thinking about her. He had offered her refuge, but the more he saw of Ava, the more he realized how much she needed, not just physically, but emotionally. She had built walls around herself, walls that were as strong as they were fragile. He could see it in the way she moved through the house, the way she flinched when anyone came too close. She had been hurt before, he was sure of it. But what had happened to her? Why had she ended up pregnant and alone on the streets? One evening, as the sun began to set and the golden light of dusk filtered through the windows, Richard invited Ava to dinner. He hoped that a quiet, peaceful evening together would help her open up. They sat at the table, the weight of silence pressing down on them as they ate. Finally, Richard couldn't take it anymore. "Ava, you don't have to tell me everything, but I need to know what happened. You've been through so much. Let me help you. Please." Ava's hands shook as she set down her fork. The question had been hanging in the air for days, and now it had been spoken aloud. She stared at her plate, her mind racing. She wanted to tell him the truth, to open up, but the pain was too fresh. The thought of going back to that dark place was too much. I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's too much." Richard leaned forward, his gaze softening. "Ava, I'm not here to judge you. I just want to help." She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with unshed tears. Richard's heart broke at the sight. He had seen so many people in his life wealthy, powerful, and unshaken by anything. But here was Ava, a girl who had nothing, and yet carried a world of hurt with her. I was with someone," she said, her voice faltering. "Someone who promised to love me. But when I got pregnant, She stopped, shaking her head as if to clear the memories away. "He abandoned me, left me with nothing." Richard felt a surge of anger. How could someone do that? How could someone treat another human being like that? But, instead of reacting, he stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue. "I was lost," Ava continued, her eyes focused on her hands. "I didn't know where to go. No one cared. I thought about ending it all so many times. But the baby, I couldn't do that. I had to keep fighting." Richard reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "I'm sorry. You didn't deserve any of that." Ava didn't say anything, but the tears finally began to fall. She had never told anyone about her pain before. She had kept it all bottled up inside, never trusting anyone enough to share it. But for some reason, she felt safe with Richard. He wasn't like the others. He didn't see her as just a pregnant girl on the street. He saw her as someone who needed help. But as the evening wore on, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ava's story. Who was this man who had abandoned her? And why did she refuse to talk about him in more detail? Something didn't add up, and Richard's instincts told him that he hadn't uncovered the full truth yet. But what could he do? She was clearly traumatized, and he didn't want to push her too hard. As they finished dinner, Richard decided to take a different approach. He would help Ava, no matter what. He wasn't going to let her slip through his fingers. But what would he do next? How would he navigate this unexpected situation? Just as he was about to suggest they go for a walk to clear their heads, there was a knock at the door. Richard froze. Who could that be at this hour? He got up, walked toward the door, and opened it, expecting to see one of his staff, or maybe a friend stopping by. But what he saw stunned him. Standing in the doorway was a man tall, imposing, with an expression of anger and determination. "Where is she?" the man demanded, his voice sharp. "Where is Ava?" Richard's heart skipped a beat. Who was this man, and why was he looking for Ava? Ava's face went pale as she heard the voice. She stood up quickly, her chair scraping against the floor. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not him." Richard looked back at Ava. confusion and concern written across his face. "Ava, who is this?" But Ava was already backing away, fear creeping into her eyes. She didn't say a word as the man stepped forward, his presence filling the room with an ominous energy. And with that, the situation escalated. Would Ava finally face the man from her past? Or was Richard about to be dragged into a conflict that would threaten everything? The man at the door wasn't just anyone. Richard could see the tension in Ava's face as she slowly backed away from him, her eyes wide with fear. He hadn't seen her react like this before. Her usually calm and composed demeanor was replaced with pure terror. Richard turned his attention back to the man standing in the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and radiated an air of authority. His presence seemed to suck all the air out of the room, and for a moment, Richard didn't know whether to fight or flee. "I'll ask you one more time," the man said, his voice cold and commanding. "Where is she?" Ava's hands trembled as she took a step back, her back now pressed against the wall. Richard instinctively took a step forward, positioning himself between the man and Ava. He wasn't sure what was going on, but one thing was certain: he wasn't about to let anyone hurt her. "You'll have to leave," Richard said, his voice firm. "I don't know who you are, but you're not welcome here." The man glanced at Richard with a look that could have frozen a lake. "You don't understand, do you?" he sneered. "She's mine. You don't know what you're getting involved in." Richard's heart skipped a beat. "Mine?" The words sent a chill down his spine. What did this man mean? Ava's past was clearly more complicated than he had realized. But this man, whoever he was, seemed to be a bigger part of it than he had imagined. Ava, her eyes still wide with fear, finally spoke. "Please, just go," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't want any more trouble." The man's gaze never left Richard as he took a step closer. "I'm not here for you," he said, his eyes narrowing. "I'm here for her." Richard could feel his temper rising. "I told you," he said, his voice getting louder. "She's not going anywhere with you." Ava's hands clasped together tightly as she stepped forward. "I can't go back," she said softly, barely above a whisper. "I can't go back to him." Richard's gaze flickered between Ava and the man, trying to piece together what was happening. He could see the fear in Ava's eyes, and he knew that whatever this man was to her, he wasn't someone who had her best interests at heart. The man chuckled darkly. "You think you can protect her? She belongs to me, whether she likes it or not." His eyes turned toward Ava, and his expression twisted with disgust. "She ran away like a coward, but I'm not done with her. I'm taking her back where she belongs." Richard's blood ran cold. This was not just about a broken relationship or a troubled past, it was something darker. Something more sinister. This man wasn't just an ex-boyfriend or someone from her past. He was a threat. "I don't know who you think you are," Richard said, stepping closer to the man, "but you're not taking anyone anywhere. Not while I'm here." The man laughed again, his voice cold and cruel. "You don't get it, do you? She's mine, and you've just made a big mistake by getting involved." The situation was escalating quickly. Richard could feel the tension in the room growing by the second. Ava's terror was palpable, and it was clear that whatever this man had done to her in the past, he wasn't done yet. Richard's protective instincts kicked in. He wasn't going to let this man take Ava anywhere, but how could he stop him? Before Richard could react, the man took a step back, reaching into his coat pocket. Ava gasped, her body tensing in fear. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he instinctively stepped in front of her. "What do you think you're doing?" Richard demanded, his voice low and threatening. The man paused, his hand still in his pocket. "I don't want to cause a scene, Mr. Langford," he said, his voice taking on a more sinister tone. "But if you keep standing in my way, things might get ugly." Richard's mind raced. He had to act fast. He couldn't let this man intimidate him or Ava. He had the power, the wealth, and the resources to stop this man. But right now, all he had was his wits and the will to protect her. In a flash, Richard grabbed his phone from his pocket and dialed security, his voice steady as he spoke. "I need you to send someone to the front door. Now, there's a man here who won't leave. Finders most at bees." The man at the door scowled, his posture stiffening, as he saw Richard making the call. "You think you can call for help? You're wasting your time." But Richard wasn't worried. He had already made his move. He hung up the phone, his gaze never leaving the man. "I've already called security," he said. "You're not going to get far." The man glared at Richard for a moment, his eyes flashing with fury. But before he could make another move, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. A group of Richard's personal security team appeared at the entrance, their presence intimidating. The man hesitated, his face turning a shade paler as he realized the situation was quickly slipping out of his control. "Leave," Richard said firmly. "Now, or I'll make sure you regret it." The man stared at him for a moment longer, then muttered something under his breath. With one last glance at Ava, he turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy and defeated. Richard's security team kept their eyes on him as he left, making sure he didn't return. As the door closed behind him, Richard turned to Ava, who was now trembling, her hands clasped tightly together. She was silent, her face pale, and Richard could tell that the encounter had shaken her to her core. Richard reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said softly. "No one's going to hurt you again. I won't let them." Ava didn't speak at first. She just stared at the floor, her tears silently falling down her cheeks. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she whispered, "Thank you." Richard nodded, his eyes softening. "You don't have to thank me. I'm here for you." But as he looked at her, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man who had just left wasn't the only danger lurking in her past. There was more to this story than Ava had let on, and Richard was determined to uncover the truth. But what was he going to find? And what did it mean for his future with her? The night that followed was tense. Ava had retreated to her room, her face pale and her eyes filled with a storm of emotions. Richard, however, couldn't stop thinking about the man who had shown up at his doorstep. There was something deeply unsettling about the encounter. Richard had never been one to back down, but the look in that man's eyes, the certainty with which he had spoken, had shaken him. Who was he, really? And why had he been so certain that Ava belonged to him? Richard's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on his door. He looked up, surprised, before he called out, "Come in!" It was Ava. She stood hesitantly at the threshold, her expression a mix of uncertainty and gratitude. She was dressed in a soft robe, her hair disheveled, and Richard could tell that she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red, likely from the tears that had been building up for days. But now there was something else in her gaze. Something different. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to cause so much trouble. You didn't deserve all of this." Richard stood up and walked over to her, his heart aching for her. She had been through so much, and despite the brief but intense encounter with the man, she was still willing to apologize. But he couldn't let her take the blame for this. "Not for anything. You didn't cause any trouble," Richard said gently, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. "This isn't your fault. You're not to blame for anything that happened tonight, but you need to tell me what's going on. I can't protect you if I don't know the full story." Ava hesitated. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, avoiding Richard's gaze. The silence between them stretched, heavy and thick. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quivering with emotion. "I never wanted to bring this kind of trouble to you," she said, taking a deep breath. "But I think it's time I tell you everything." Richard nodded, his gaze steady and calm. "You don't have to tell me all at once, but I need to know what we're up against." Ava walked over to the sofa and sat down, her hands trembling in her lap. Richard sat beside her, giving her space to gather her thoughts. The room was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, Ava began to speak, her voice barely audible. "I don't know where to start," she whispered, her face flushed with embarrassment. "But that man, his name is Derek. He's my father's business partner. They made a deal, and I was part of it." Richard frowned, not fully understanding. "Part of what deal?" Ava's eyes welled up with tears again, and she wiped her eyes quickly, ashamed of her vulnerability. "My father wasn't a good man, Richard. He used me as leverage in a business deal with Derek. When I got pregnant, my father, he didn't want anything to do with me. He left me, abandoned me, and Derek, he took over. He said I owed him. I owed him for what my father had done." Richard's heart sank as he began to piece together the story. Ava had been trapped in a world of manipulation and deceit. It wasn't just a broken relationship. It was something far darker. And now, Derek, the man who had shown up at his door, was still trying to control her, to bring her back into that world. Ava looked up at Richard, her eyes full of fear. "I don't know how to escape it. Derek, he's dangerous. He's done things Things I can't even begin to explain. He doesn't care about me or my baby. He only cares about control." Richard's anger flared. How could someone treat her this way? How could anyone use a young woman as a pawn in a business game? "I'm not going to let him hurt you," Richard said firmly, his voice low with determination. "I'll protect you, Ava. You don't have to go back to him. You don't have to go through this alone." But Ava shook her head, her voice cracking as she spoke. "It's not that simple. He won't stop until he gets what he wants. And right now, he wants me. I don't know what he'll do next, but I know it won't end well if I don't give in." Richard leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. He couldn't let Ava go back to Derek. But the situation was more complicated than he had realized. Derek was powerful, and if he had the resources to make Ava's life a living nightmare, Richard knew that he needed to be careful. "We'll figure this out," Richard said, more to himself than to Ava. "But we need to stay ahead of him. If he's playing games with you, we'll play smarter." "It won't sting." Ava looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "But what if he's already 2 steps ahead?" Richard stood up, walking over to the window, his mind racing. He had everything at his disposal: money, power, influence, but none of that mattered if he couldn't protect her. And now, he wasn't just fighting for Ava, he was fighting for the truth, fighting for her freedom. "I'll make sure he regrets crossing us," Richard said, his voice low and firm. "But first, I need to know everything about Derek, and the deal with your father. I can't go in blind. If we're going to take him down, we have to know exactly what we're dealing with." Ava nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I'll tell you everything, Richard. I don't know where to start." Richard turned back to her, his expression softening. "Start wherever you're comfortable. We're in this together." But just as they were beginning to talk more about Derek and the dangerous web of lies that had ensnared Ava, the phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Richard's heart skipped a beat as he glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. "Hello?" he answered, his voice steady. There was a pause on the other end before a voice, cold and menacing, spoke. "Richard Langford, we need to talk. Meet me tomorrow night at 8 p.m. at the old warehouse by the docks. If you want your little friend to stay safe, you'll come alone." Richard's blood ran cold as the voice hung up abruptly, leaving a sense of dread hanging in the air. Ava stood up, her face pale. "Who was that?" Richard's hand tightened around the phone. "It's Derek. He's playing games with us." Ava's eyes widened with fear, and Richard knew that this was just the beginning. Whatever had started with a chance encounter on the street had now spiraled into something far more dangerous, and the stakes were higher than ever. As Richard stood there, staring at the phone, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what was to come. He had no choice but to confront Derek, but the question remained, would he walk into a trap? Or was this the moment when everything would finally come to light? The clock was ticking, and Richard knew one thing for sure: the story wasn't over. Not yet. What would happen when they met at the warehouse? Would this encounter bring the truth to light? Or would it be the final game in a deadly game of cat and mouse? Stay tuned for part 2.